In India, pre-2014, productivity growth annually was 1.3%, the rate of productivity growth. In contrast, the rate of productivity growth post-2014 has been 2.7%. That is more than double. And I think that is a very important driver, for growth to continue to be, a high and for it to be sustainable going forward. India will continue to be the, driver for global growth. I expect, growth for India to be consistently above 7%, in this decade.
Let's just talk about the India growth story. What really is the impression of a sentiment, when it comes to India's economy during these meetings here?
So if you look at the, the Indian economy now, ever since COVID, it has grown consistently at 7% plus. 9.7% the year after COVID, then 7%, and then this year, if you look at the first three quarters, 8.2%, 8.1%, and 8.4% growth in the first three quarters. So even with a much lower 7.3% growth, if it so happens actually in the fourth quarter, India will average 8% growth, and I think that is very good, in the current global economic situation. As I said, 3.1%, expectation for the global economy. Now, the fund itself has revised its projection for growth, for India for this year to 7.8%, which is reflecting, the overall growth. I do want to, also mention, I think, if you look at productivity improvements, this is something which is really important. If you look at the Penn World Tables data, which is actually what economists use across the world to understand the drivers of growth, in India, pre-2014, productivity growth annually was 1.3%, the rate of productivity growth. In contrast, the rate of productivity growth post-2014 has been 2.7%. That is more than double. And I think that is a very important driver, for growth to continue to be, a high and for it to be sustainable going forward.
Right. How do you respond to the critics who have other opinions about, India's economy at present? What is your response?
So I would say two things. Firstly, if you look at the commentary given by statistical experts, there was an interview that was published in the Business Standard, of two former chief statisticians, Pranab Sen and TCA Anant, and one, and a former chairman of the National Statistical Commission, PC Mohanan. All of whom were asked about some of the economists' criticism of the GDP methodology and GDP numbers, and they were unanimous that that there is nothing to worry or nothing to sort of that is untoward about the GDP numbers. So I think that is statistical experts that are across the spectrum, actually saying that the GDP numbers can be trusted. I think I would go by that. Let me also add my own assessment. If you look at the gross value added, the growth in gross value added versus GDP, in the first quarter it was 8.2% for both. So there was no difference between growth, in gross value added and GDP. In the second quarter, gross value added grew at 7.7%. That was just 40 basis points less than 8.1% growth in the GDP in the second quarter. Only in the third quarter has there been a higher wedge with gross value added growing at 6.5% versus 8.4% for GDP. Even that I actually think is quite well understood given the tax buoyancy. I've looked at the numbers over the last decade. The median number for tax buoyancy has been 1.6. In other words, 1% increase in GDP growth, nominal GDP growth, has translated into 1.6% on in terms of the medians in tax growth. So I think when you put all these three aspects together, I think some of the criticism or people saying that they're surprised about the GDP growth, I think is completely unwarranted.
Right. Another criticism was about recently the economist Thomas Piketty had argued in a report that India's income inequality is worse than that under the British rule. Does this raise alarms about the Indian economy anywhere?
If you look at the recent consumption survey that has been released, now experts have actually clarified very clearly that the 2011-12 consumption survey and the 2022-23 consumption survey are indeed comparable because the survey method is indeed the same. When you look at those numbers, both poverty and inequality have declined significantly. Poverty, for instance, using the $1.9 per capita per day in 2011 PPP numbers, has declined from 12% to 2%. That's a significant decline. Even using a higher threshold of $3.2, per capita per day, is again in 2011 purchasing power parity, the decline has been from more than 50% to less than 30%. So I think it's significant. At the same time, the same survey numbers also reveal that inequality, and this is carefully constructed data using very large consumption survey. Both urban and rural inequality have declined. For instance, the Gini coefficient has actually declined from 36 in 2012 to about I think less than 30 in 2022. This is for urban areas, and rural areas the Gini has declined from 29 to 27. So I think the carefully constructed data from consumption clearly shows that consumption inequality has declined significantly. And as for the analysis done by Thomas Piketty, I think it is, a sort of a mix of a lot of data, especially tax data, and I think there are clearly methodological concerns. For instance, if you look at capital gains, which is treated as income, in the tax data, that is not counted as part of GDP calculations. So also there are important, sort of some very heroic assumptions that have to be made, in order to be able to actually assess inequality just from, tax data, which is taxes are paid by a very low, small section, because in order to compare inequality, you have to actually look at the tax data vis-a-vis those people who actually large section who don't pay taxes. So I think lots of heroic assumptions have to be made, and I think if they do it far more without any overt and covert biases, I think what they would find would be closer to what the consumption survey data is clearly revealing, right, which is significant decline in inequality.
Right. Now, while the growth in India seems to be high, some commentators are observing that the GDP growth may not be, maybe overstated. Do you agree on that? Could you give us your perspective on that?
So I think shared on that earlier. I said that the gross value added actually, as you saw in the first quarter, growth in gross value added and that in GDP was the same, 8.2%. Second quarter, 7.7% for gross value added, while GDP growth was 8.1%, not a large difference. Only in the third quarter. And as I also said, statistical experts across the spectrum have actually clearly opined that the GDP methodology and these GDP numbers are quite robust.
Right. Could you give us a sense of the Indian subcontinent? What's the state of economy there, and where does India really stand? When it comes to its neighbors.
I think the Indian economy is clearly doing very well. A couple of countries, that are part of my portfolio, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, have actually, are part of IMF programs now. Sri Lanka, as we all know, had some economic difficulties and, is going through. I think they're implementing a lot of reform programs. Bangladesh is also part of, IMF program, and I think they're also, things are looking cautiously optimistic. New government has come into power, but I think clearly, in terms of the overall state of the economy, India seems to be clearly the star there.
All right. Now, IMF has been very appreciative of India's efforts when it comes to the digital infrastructure, something that we saw last meetings as well.
Yeah.
What lesson does this offer to the rest of the world, especially the countries in the global south?
So, this is an aspect that I think, especially at the IMF board, that really gladdens my heart. If you look at how digital transactions are done in India, in India, you can, use your phone to pay for, a glass of coconut water or a coffee, or even if actually, and a few months back I was actually with my mom, and went for some, shopping basically for vegetables in the local mandi, and I pulled out my phone and I was able to pay. So it's just become so widespread, and everybody is using. One can even actually go and shop, for instance, in a Sarojini Nagar or in a fashion street in Bombay, and the street vendors are also actually taking digital payments. That's the kind of widespread use of digital payments that has basically happened, and that's what is reflected in the IMF being very appreciative of the kind of infrastructure that is being created. One critical aspect, and these are actually important lessons for the global south, is that this digital infrastructure has been created as a public good. The sovereign has created it rather than allowing basically or requiring private sector to create it. What that does is that when private sector creates such infrastructure, that can become a monopoly, and therefore the prices can be actually far may not be affordable for everybody. In contrast, by the sovereign, the Indian government creating this, access has been widespread, and I think that's a very important lesson, for the global south. I think, and the Honorable Prime Minister has been on record saying that, India is more than happy to actually share, the knowledge from this with all the countries, including the advanced economies. For instance, a lot of remittances, and I think, the use of this digital infrastructure, for remittances globally can actually reduce not only the time, but even the cost for this, and I think that can be enormous efficiency gains for the global economy. So not only the global south, but even advanced economies can, I think, learn from India on this aspect.
How do you view the situation of the global economy if you see the larger picture, and where does really India stand there?
I think India will continue to be the driver for global growth in the foreseeable future. Maximum sort of contributor to global growth. I expect growth for India to be consistently above 7%. In this decade. You would recall back in September 2021. When I was with the government as well, actually I predicted that India will emerging out of COVID will have 7% plus growth. So I continue to maintain that assessment.